The lights blazed hot above the stage, illuminating two men who had once occupied the same office but couldn't be further apart in character. On one side stood Barack Obama, composed, hands folded, waiting to speak. On the other, Donald Trump, paced like a prize-fighter, jabbing at the air with half-truths and swagger. "And people like him," Trump sneered, motioning toward Obama without looking at him. "They had their turn, and they failed. They embarrassed this country. They caved to globalists. They apologized for America." The crowd, charged, restless, howled in approval. Camera flashes burst like fireworks. Somewhere in the back, a chant began to form. Obama shifted slightly, preparing to respond. He adjusted his mic. A pause. Trump turned. "Sit down, boy." The words sliced through the room like a cold wind. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Gasps. Audible. The moderator's head whipped around. A woman in the front row clasped her chest. One of the cameramen dropped focus. "Did he just—" someone whispered. The air was sucked from the room. On every screen across the country, millions watched the split-screen freeze. Trump with a curled lip. Obama still seated, blinking once, slowly. The insult wasn't new. Not really. It was old as American sin. But hearing it on live television, in 2025, directed at the nation's first black president, it felt like history clawing its way forward through a suit and a microphone. Trump, grinning now, leaned back from the podium as if he'd delivered the line of the night. Obama didn't move, not yet. He stared forward, not at Trump, not at the moderator, but at something far beyond the stage. The silence lengthened. On Twitter, hashtags detonated. On TikTok, creators hit record. The country held its breath. And then, just before the feed cut to commercial, Obama stood. What Barack Obama said next wasn't just a comeback. It wasn't even a clapback. It was a cultural earthquake that would shake every pillar of power in the room. But this wasn't the first time Barack Obama had faced this kind of disrespect, and this time America was going to hear his answer. It wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. "Sit down, boy." Didn't echo in that auditorium alone. It reverberated through every courtroom where dignity had been denied, every lunch counter where voices had been silenced, every classroom where black excellence had been questioned. The phrase was old, older than Trump, older than politics. It carried the dust of shackles and the stain of a whip. A command meant to shrink, to humiliate, to control. And the man it was aimed at? He had once stood before the world with his hand on the Bible, sworn in as president while descendants of slaves wept in front of the Capitol. Now he'd been told to sit like a child, like a servant, like a threat that needed to be put back, in his place. America had heard that phrase before, from sheriffs in Alabama, from governors blocking schoolhouse doors, from fathers whispering poison into their sons' ears. But never from a former president, broadcast across every screen in the nation. The reaction was instant. Twitter erupted, screens flooded with disbelief. Did Trump just call Obama boy? Unacceptable, racist, bold, dangerous. The hashtags poured in like wildfire. "Ow, sit down, boy." "He stood up." "Obama speaks." Think pieces hit Substack. Before the ad break ended, journalists scrambled to confirm what viewers already knew in their bones. Yes, they'd heard right. And no, it wasn't just politics. It was personal. In a split-screen shot circulating within minutes, Obama remained, motionless, still seated. But not in defeat. Not in deference. In command. The kind of stillness that only comes from years of carrying the weight of grace under fire. He blinked, once, lifted his chin, said nothing. That silence, that stillness was louder than any insult. You could see it in the moderator's face, tension so tight her jaw trembled. You could see it in the crowd, heads whipping between the two men, unsure whether they'd witnessed a gaffe, a gambit, or a generational reckoning. Slow-motion replays zoomed in on the exact moment, Obama's fingers resting on the desk. Trump's grin faltering ever so slightly. The crowd caught between thunderous applause and sharp discomfort. Cable panels flared to life. Civil rights scholars called it a coded racial attack. Political strategists labeled it a moment that could define the campaign. But online, especially among younger audiences, something else surged: fury and pride. Black TikTokers stitched footage of Obama's composure with stories of their own fathers, uncles, and teachers enduring the same quiet humiliations. Immigrant teens posted side-by-sides of their parents at naturalization ceremonies, eyes filled with the same stoic fire. It wasn't about just one insult anymore, it was about all of them. And still Obama said nothing. Not yet. That silence wasn't passive. It was preparation. It was the coiling before the strike, the pause between lightning and thunder. Because he knew as many watching knew that this wasn't just a clapback moment. It was legacy. But to understand Obama's thunderous silence, to truly grasp the force building behind his eyes, we need to go back to the making of the man who would deliver one of the most powerful clapbacks in modern political history. He wasn't born into struggle. He was born into gold-plated bathrooms and inheritance. Long before the presidency, Donald Trump had already mastered the art of volume over value, of branding bluster as vision. He didn't need to be right. He just needed to be loud. From tabloid covers to primetime cameos, Trump built a persona, the brash billionaire who answered to no one. He was unapologetic, unfiltered, and crucially unaccountable. America, or at least parts of it, mistook that for strength. But it wasn't until 2011 that Trump discovered the explosive currency of racialized doubt. The birther lie, the baseless claim that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States, wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a weapon, a slow drip of delegitimization, and Trump wielded it with glee. Night after night, he went on cable news shows, smirking, "I'm just asking questions," while planting seeds of something far uglier. The country's first black president had already survived the gauntlet of political life. But Trump wanted to claw at something deeper, his right to belong. When the birth certificate was released, Trump didn't apologize. He doubled down. He'd learned what got ratings: provocation, humiliation, dominance. From there, the mask slipped further. The insults sharpened. John McCain? Not a war hero. Carly Fiorina? Look at that face. Immigrants? Rapists? Protesters? Throw 'em out. And every time he crossed a line, the crowd grew louder. The brand grew stronger. The boundaries grew thinner. He dodged the Vietnam draft not once, but 5 times, and then stood before troops as their commander-in-chief. He mocked Gold Star families. He embraced dictators while undermining allies. And through it all, he grinned like the rules never applied to him. Because for most of his life, they hadn't. But one name always seemed to linger behind his insults: Obama even. After leaving office, Obama haunted Trump. Every signature policy Trump attempted to undo, every rally riff, every grievance, somehow it always circled back. The Paris Agreement, the Iran deal, the ACA, if Obama had touched it, Trump wanted it dismantled, erased. There were no speeches about Clinton's legacy, no tirades against Bush or Carter. But Obama? He lived rent-free in Trump's head, not because of what he did, but because of who he was. A black man who had led with intellect, dignity, and poise. Everything Trump knew he could never fake, and beneath the bravado, that truth burned. Trump's obsession wasn't just political, it was personal. Every time Obama's name drew cheers, Trump snarled. Every poll that ranked Obama higher, Every memoir that outsold his own ghost-written glory, it grated. He couldn't outthink him, couldn't outclass him, couldn't outshine him. So he did what he always did when threatened. He lashed out, but arrogance has a rhythm. It builds and builds until it crashes under the weight of its own noise. And Trump, who had always relied on spectacle, never noticed the trap he was setting for himself. Every jab, every slur, every smug chuckle on stage wasn't just a line in a speech. It was tinder. And when he finally threw that match, "Sit down, boy," he didn't realize how dry the forest had become. He thought it was just another moment, another headline, another night of applause. But what he didn't understand, what he could never understand, was that his words weren't just insults. They were summons, because Obama didn't rise to argue. He rose for something far greater. But Trump never understood what he was really provoking until Obama stood to speak. He was born in Honolulu, between oceans and worlds, a boy of 2 continents and 2 skin tones. Barack Hussein. Obama's earliest memories weren't of political ambition or power. They were of searching, for place, for meaning, for belonging. His mother, Anne, was his first teacher. A white woman from Kansas with a heart that crossed borders, she raised him with books, with questions, with a belief in empathy as strength. His father, gone. His stepfather, distant. He grew up holding contradictions, loved but alone, brilliant but uncertain, American but always asked to prove it. On playgrounds, he was too black. In classrooms, not black enough. Even the mirror seemed undecided. And yet, it was in that in-between that he began to sharpen, not through defiance, but through restraint. In college, he searched harder. He read Baldwin, Du Bois, Achebe. He smoked, he drifted. He asked questions that didn't always have answers. But in Chicago, on the streets of the South Side, he found something solid. He became a community organizer, not a headline maker, a listener. It was thankless work. Worn-out churches, broken sidewalks, empty refrigerators. But he learned the rhythm of change. Slow, gritty, earned. Then Harvard. A black man with a name no one could pronounce, rising to become president of the Law Review, the first in its history. It made headlines. But what it really did was give him a seat in rooms where few like him had ever been allowed. Still, even there, identity was a performance. Too polished, and he was accused of being an elite. Too raw, and he was stereotyped. So he walked the tightrope, always calm, always calculating, always gracious. And yet, the scars showed. He once spoke of his white grandmother, loving, proud, who sometimes confessed her fear of black men on the street. Obama said it quietly, not bitterly, as if trying to explain America to itself. That was the man who ran for president. The man who rose not on fury, but hope. Yes, he was inspirational, but also measured. Every word tested, every gesture calibrated. He knew that as the first black president, he didn't just speak for himself, he carried history. And when he won, they called it post-racial. But it wasn't unity he stepped into. It was a storm. Where's the birth certificate? He's a secret Muslim. He hates white people. Let's make America great again. It was a barrage dressed in policy, coded in otherness. And still, he smiled. He quoted Lincoln. He danced with his daughters. He gave the nation 8 years of dignity, even when it gave him disrespect in return. He read letters late into the night from mothers without health care, from kids terrified of deportation, from soldiers on third tours. He responded in pen, by hand, until his own fingers ached. And when decisions weighed too heavily, he sat alone in the residence, sipping tea, listening to jazz, watching the country sleep. He wasn't perfect. He'd be the first to say that. But he believed in a version of America that was better than its history, and he governed like it was still possible. Then came the backlash. Then came Trump. Birtherism, the wall, the Muslim ban, Charlottesville, Obama stayed silent mostly, not because he didn't feel, but because he understood the weight of his voice. He chose dignity, again and again, even when others chose cruelty. But dignity isn't weakness, and silence isn't surrender. He knew how. This country saw men who looked like him when they raised their voices. So he waited. He watched. And then, in that moment on stage with the nation watching, with the insult hanging in the air like poison, he felt something shift, because he wasn't just responding for himself. He was standing for every kid who'd been told they weren't enough, for every immigrant whose name was mocked, for every family who had ever taught their children to sit tall even when the world tried to shrink them. He had turned the other cheek. He had waited his turn. He had risen without rage, but this time was different. And that's why this time, he didn't stay silent. It began like every other moment Trump tried to dominate with noise. He leaned forward, jabbing the air with two fingers, chest puffed, voice booming. Let me tell you something, folks. This guy here, he had his chance. 8 years of weakness, apologizing for America, making deals that made us a joke. And now he wants to lecture me? The crowd stirred. Some clapped. Others didn't know how to react. It was the kind of bait Trump had tossed out 100 times before. And Obama, as he always had, waited, calm, ready. He raised his hand, slow and deliberate. He didn't interrupt. He waited to be acknowledged, to be given the floor not because he needed permission, but because he still believed in order, in principle. But Trump wasn't finished. No, Barack. You don't get to do that here, Trump snapped, voice rising. You had your turn. You failed. You embarrassed us. Obama turned slightly toward the moderator. If I could respond. Sit down, boy. The room froze. It didn't register, at first. Like hearing something too wild to believe and then realizing, yes, you did hear what you think you did. A woman in the second row gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth like muscle memory. The moderator blinked twice, her mouth opening, then closing. Behind the cameras, producers scrambled, mouthing to each other, not sure if they should cut to commercial, zoom in, or let it burn. Did he just... The phrase exploded online before the silence even finished falling. On TikTok, creators clipped the moment. On Twitter, the hashtag #SitDownBoy trended within seconds. Memes, rage, shock. Some defended it, called it just words. Others saw it for what it was, a calculated racial degradation. But inside that room, time slowed. Obama hadn't flinched. He hadn't smirked. He simply sat, still and composed. He looked at Trump, eyes narrowed not in anger, but recognition, the kind that comes from seeing the same scene play out for decades, just with different actors and brighter lights. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. A breath. He exhaled. Slowly. There was no visible tension in his shoulders, no twitch in his jaw, only stillness, the kind forged by years of bearing it all with grace. And the room waited to see if he would laugh it off, waited to see if he would take the bait, waited to see if the man who had once led the free world would simply nod and sit back down to keep the peace, to not rock the boat, to let the insult stand like so many before it. But the boat was already rocking. The air itself had changed. Young staffer near the back stood with her phone pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with something between awe and anticipation. The insult hung in the air like a spark in dry grass, and then Barack Obama stood up. Not just to Trump, but to a century of indignities. Barack Obama didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He didn't gesture. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and looked across the stage at the man who had tried to shrink him with a word. The room was silent, not with peace, but with pressure. The kind of quiet that comes just before something breaks. Obama leaned into the mic. "You know," he began, voice low but steady, "there's history in that word." He turned slightly toward the audience, his eyes scanning the faces, some stunned, some angry, some just waiting to see if this would be another moment where dignity swallowed pain. He continued, "My grandfather told me stories of being called boy while wearing a uniform, serving a country that wouldn't serve him back. Pause. In Mississippi, in Alabama, in Georgia, that word was never just a word. It was a leash. It was a cage. It was a reminder to brilliant, strong, grown black men that no matter how tall they stood, someone wanted them on their knees." He exhaled. Emmett Till was called boy before he was lynched at 14. Medgar Evers was called boy before he was gunned down in his own driveway. Martin Luther King Jr. was called boy by politicians who feared his words more than their own guns. A shiver ran through the crowd. The camera panned to the front row. A woman nodded through tears. A young black man clenched his fist just below his chin. Obama's voice didn't tremble. It thickened. "You don't get to speak to me like that," he said, looking directly at Trump now. "Not today, not ever again." Murmurs swelled across the room. The air cracked like a storm on the horizon. "You may not like what I stand for. You may resent what my presidency meant for this country, for its future. That's your right. But what you don't get to do is erase the road that got me here." He stepped forward. "You see, when you say, 'Sit down, boy,' what you're really saying is, you scare me. Your dignity, your calm, your very existence, it threatens everything I pretend to be." Now the tension was snapping. Jaws dropped. Phones rose. The moderator, speechless. "But let me remind you," he said, his voice now lifting, not shouting, rising like a preacher at the crest of a sermon. "You don't get to define me." He glanced at the crowd, and for the first time allowed himself the faintest smile. "You call me boy," he said, pausing just long enough, "but my daughters call me Dad." A thunderclap of murmurs surged through the audience. "The American people," he said, "twice called me Mr. President." Applause broke through. Scattered at first, then swelling like a wave. Trump shifted. His face flushed beneath the lights. He opened his mouth, but no sound followed. His fingers twitched against the podium like he was flipping through note cards that weren't there. His bravado drained as the spotlight turned cold. Obama turned back toward him, calm as ever. "You want to talk about strength?" he said. "Strength isn't loud. It doesn't come from a mic or a stage or a slogan." He pointed gently to his chest. "It comes from knowing who you are even when the world tells you you're not enough." The crowd now was roaring. Some were standing. Some were crying. Some simply stared, transfixed, unable to believe they were witnessing what felt like more than a speech, something tectonic. Obama took one last look at Trump. Not with anger, with pity. "If you want me to sit down," he said softly, slowly, deliberately, "you're going to have to stand up for something real." He stepped back. Silence, a moment so thick it felt like time itself paused to catch its breath. And then the room erupted, not just in applause, but in catharsis, in recognition, in release. People surged to their feet. Applause rolled through the auditorium like thunder across mountains, the sound of history being made in real time, the sound of a country reminded of its conscience. And somewhere, in living rooms and dorms and break rooms across America, people stood too, not because they were told to, but because something inside them rose up with him. But the shockwaves were just beginning, and America was about to choose a side. The moment didn't end when Obama stepped back. It detonated. Within minutes, the internet fractured into a storm of reaction, reverence, and raw emotion. The clip, 38 seconds of surgical dignity, surged across platforms like lightning. TikTok flooded with edits layered over protest anthems. Twitter turned into a digital battlefield of memes, outrage, and applause. And one phrase lit up every screen. "Stand up, Mr. President." It wasn't just trending, it was transcending. Across time zones, across languages, across oceans. A Ghanaian radio host called it a moment for the diaspora. An Australian paper ran the headline, "Barack Obama just silenced history's insult." Even in Europe, evening news anchors quoted him word for word. On Instagram, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson posted a clip with the caption, "That's how you shut it down, with calm, with fire, with legacy." Trevor Noah released a segment the same night titled, "Obama didn't just clap back, he changed the game." Within hours, it hit 5 million views. Civil rights leaders from every generation weighed in. Jesse Jackson called it a reminder of who we are and who we refuse to be. Angela Rye said, "That was bigger than a comeback. That was a correction." Even Coretta Scott King's Foundation tweeted a quote from Maya Angelou. "Still, like dust, I'll rise." Cable news spiraled. MSNBC looped the clip every half hour. Rachel Maddow leaned back in her chair and whispered, "That wasn't a moment. That was a turning point." Over at Fox News, the spin was in overdrive. "Disrespectful," they said. "Rehearsed. An attack on presidential decorum." One commentator even suggested Obama had played the race card, as if race hadn't already been played and weaponized moments before. But the disconnect was glaring, because while pundits debated, America reacted. A teacher in Detroit scrapped her lesson plan and played the speech to her 9th grade civics class. One student, usually quiet, raised his hand and said, "That's how I want to speak when they try to put me down." A 4th grader in Houston wrote a poem titled "He Called Him Boy, But I Saw a King." His mother posted it on Facebook. It went viral by sunset. A pastor in Atlanta opened his Sunday sermon by quoting Obama's line, "You don't get to speak to me like that." The congregation stood as one. On YouTube, remixes poured in. Gen Z creators layered Obama's voice over Kendrick Lamar's DNA, over gospel choirs, even over lo-fi beats. The speech became soundtrack, affirmation, declaration. Everywhere, micro moments bloomed. A father showed his son the clip. A daughter texted it to her immigrant mother, with the message, "This is why I walk proud." A barbershop in Brooklyn replayed it all day. So did a nail salon in Oakland. And slowly, something shifted. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about every time someone had been told to shrink and chose to rise instead. It was about reclaiming power without shouting. About wielding truth like a blade, not to wound, but to wake. Even those who didn't agree with Obama's politics paused, because something about the moment felt bigger than party, bigger than platform. It felt moral. Social media became testimony. I've never cried watching a political debate before. That line? That one line? I felt it in my bones. My grandfather was called Boy. He would have loved this. Finally, someone said what needed to be said with class. The ripple was cultural, political, emotional. And just as the country caught its breath, bracing for what came next, it came, because buried in the applause, in the hashtags, in the remixes and reaction videos, there were still 60 seconds left in Obama's speech. 60 seconds he hadn't planned. 60 seconds that weren't calm, weren't polished, weren't written down. And those next 60 seconds, those shook the very soul of the nation. Obama stepped forward once more, the storm of applause still echoing behind him. But his hands were raised not to command silence, but to return the room to stillness. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not out of fatigue but purpose, like a teacher before a lesson, like a father before a truth. "I didn't come here tonight to trade insults," he said. "I didn't come to shout louder, or to get even." He let that breathe. "I came because leadership isn't noise. It's not volume. It's not cruelty. Wrapped in confidence. He scanned the room, eyes catching people who'd stood for him. Faces that had felt seen for the first time in a long time. Leadership, he said, is listening when it's hard. It's speaking when it matters. It's sitting in rooms where you're unwelcome and standing anyway. A hush fell again. I was raised by people who believed in this country, even when it didn't believe in them. A mother who taught me compassion. A grandfather who served in war and told me stories of what it cost. And a grandmother who loved me but still admitted to fearing people who looked like me. He paused. That contradiction, that's America. Wounded and wondrous. Capable of harm but also healing. He turned slightly, addressing not just the crowd, but the nation watching. And I still believe in her. The room stilled. I believe in an America that isn't afraid of truth, that doesn't call dignity weakness, that doesn't treat silence as defeat. I believe in an America where your name, your skin, your story don't make you less American. They make you more. Now his voice thickened, not with tears, but with memory. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But that arc doesn't bend on its own. It bends when we pull it. Together." He looked at the man across the stage one last time. Not in anger, but with the weary understanding of someone who had spent his whole life carrying what others had thrown at him. "We are not here," Obama said, his voice rising one final time, "to tear each other down. We are here to stand up together." The crowd didn't just applaud. They rose, some with tears, some with hope, some just stunned into stillness. It wasn't a cheer. It was an awakening. And in that moment, in that brief breath between past and future, the air in the room felt different. Not because something had ended, but because something had begun. And as Obama walked off stage, it wasn't applause he left. Behind it was a silence filled with reckoning. Where were you when it happened? When one man tried to diminish a legacy with a single word, and another responded with the weight of generations behind him? Where were you when Trump told him to sit, and America stood? Because that night wasn't just about two presidents. It was about the lines we draw, the values we claim, the moments we choose to remember. It reminded us that leadership isn't measured in volume or venom, but in courage, in calm, in conviction. That dignity isn't weakness, it's resistance, refined. And that truth, respect, and decency aren't partisan virtues. They're American ones. This wasn't a soundbite. It was a stand. So tell us, where were you when Obama reminded the world what leadership looks like? Drop it in the comments. What did you feel? What did it bring back? Who did you think of? Because this isn't just a moment to watch. It's a moment to carry. Subscribe if you believe dignity wins. Share if you believe America still stands for something.